Hello, beautiful harvest gathering. I'm Eliot from Real Human Better, and it is an honor and a pleasure to be on this learning journey with all of you during this awesome virtual festival. Huge thanks for being invited and being able to participate in this. It's a magical thing to be able to come together, even virtually, and share great ideas and new ideas and learn from each other. So I am here today to talk to you about Zone 2, otherwise known as neighbors, relationships that we share close physical proximity with. In social design and social landscaping, we've probably already done work in our Zone 0 and our Zone 1, self-work, work with our close, intimate relationships. And now we're starting to get ready to put this work to use. All these tools and skills you've learned about staying grounded and being in touch with yourself are now totally usable and helpful as we begin to cultivate cooperation and community in our neighborhood. Boom! So, relationships based on proximity. What is that? How does that work? That's from Midwest Permaculture, my alma mater, who are fabulous teachers and have very much so synthesized down the big sprawling concepts of permaculture design and ethics into asking curiously, what is it and how does it work? And that's really what we want to do. We want to be curious, not go back on judgments that we have, predeterminations in our mind, but really stay curious and open to all the possibilities around us. So, physical proximity. What is it? How does it work? Well, we know that things in proximity to one another have an effect on one another. You may notice this with people you live with, and you may notice this in the garden you take care of. And if you study permaculture and you've been observing and interacting with the natural world around you for a while, you've seen there's a lot of symbiosis, a lot of cooperation in nature. Herbert Spencer, a sociologist, miscoined the term survival of the fittest, which was very catchy and fits in with a corrupted spirituality of hierarchy. However, what Darwin was really positing, of course, is that what allows for evolution and survival is adaptation to environmental niches and resources that are not being held in scarcity because so many other animals, creatures, organisms cannot actually function without them. So the ability to adapt to a new and available resource is the key to survival. And really cooperating, finding ways to share in surplus. Anyway, this is a deep spiritual thing that I'm sure we're going to keep addressing. And right now, in our neighborhood, maybe we don't need to address the deep spirituality. Again, these aren't necessarily people we share values with, but they're definitely people we're having to share our physical space with. So, in physical proximity, we have the highest amount of interaction of your own social and personal landscape with the larger social and other people's personal landscape dovetailing around a shared physical landscape, a shared resource physical landscape. This is a very tense area, essentially. And today, we're going to break down what it is, how it works, some skills for managing it and negotiating it with better success, and ways that we can continue to cultivate cooperation and community in our neighborhood. Yay! So let's talk about the physical landscape. Our physical landscape doesn't actually have that many hard divisions. Sure, there's rivers and there's ridges, but those are dynamic areas of interplay. They actually are affecting both banks, even though both banks are affected differently. The river itself is an ecosystem, even though it also represents two other ecotones between in the bank areas and the estuary areas. So, landscapes aren't really divided, they're all tangled and mishmashed together, as well as having their own separate regions, unique to them. And our social landscape is very, very similar. We're all tangled in this thing together, despite each having our own individual bearing within it. So the physical landscape, ba-boom. You already exist within a climate region, right? Going off of our scale of permanence, so in land-centric permaculture design, we design based on what are the things that are easiest to change and what are the things that are hardest to change. Changing the climate you're in is almost impossible. You can build greenhouses, shade structures, etc., but it all involves a lot of input. In land-centric permaculture, they're going to tell you to adjust the plants that you're choosing to grow. That's the easiest thing to change. Likewise, we want to understand all the steps in our scale of permanence, because these help understand the ecological districting, or areas that are around us. So we have our climate region, and then within that we have a bioregion, and within that we have watersheds, and then within that we have personal districting, the choices people are making. On top of that is a layer of economic and political reality called municipal zoning. And we can talk more about that in Zone 3. But these do impact all of the environment, and it would be foolish to pretend that they do not. Things like racial prejudice and capital prejudice, money prejudice, all affect certain aspects of private land ownership and real estate. So municipal districts don't necessarily have a natural representation that just exists in the ecosystem. It's also socially maintained and controlled in a certain way. This is both terrifying and great news, because it means that we have the chance to shift and change it. So our physical landscape has these different regions that are based a lot on the environment around us. Within it, we get closer and closer to our own little home zone, and eventually we're even having to deal with things like slope. Where is your land located on the slope against other people's? Because what those people are doing on higher slopes is going to affect everyone downslope of them. Likewise, the person downslope actually ends up collecting the most resources because everything rolls downhill. So being aware of all these things creates different dynamics, both in how we want to encounter our neighbors and why we might encounter our neighbors. So buttons, Eliot. I'm sorry I say so a lot. Here we are, super rich landscape. We understand our physical landscape outside of us. It's a little bit easier to understand a physical landscape outside of ourselves. Internally, however, what does that interaction look like? Well, I like to use a tree metaphor because it helps me fit us into a whole forest, which is a diverse social landscape, and we're sharing it with all these other trees. I have a visual I would like to show you. This is a little drawing, a little ditty I did. Here we all are, being our little trees. We're growing in the collective and personal history. We're transpiring, exhaling all these different values and ideas and beliefs, which go into creating the social atmosphere, affecting our ability, both individually and in our neighborhood, to access consciousness and benefit from it. And this value cycle here, well, we're all playing a part in the values that end up in our social institutions. And then those aquifers are feeding into every little sapling, every big tree. So we're remediating it through understanding how these cycles work. And here you've been doing work on your own intra-active, within yourself cycles of activation and healing. Finally, we're going to reach out in Zone 2, interacting a lot with the present moment and the people around us. This is going to require consistency and persistence. It's not like a one and done. You don't really just have one block party, right? You say good morning all the time. which seems hard and sometimes seems unimportant, but let me tell you, is the key to finding ecological regeneration in your neighborhood, developing more comfort, developing better safety, and in general, creating abundance that the community can both access and enjoy. So, boom, interacting in this community here is the most important, most potent thing you can do. I'm just going to keep saying it. So buttons, moving forward. We've got our states, our towns, and our districts, but we also do things informally and formally called cultivating community by creating group identifications. So you can have a block party, you can have a regular interaction sitting outside on the stoop talking to neighbors passing by, but you can also have formalized, like, the building department, the building people, the condo board, you know, these kinds of formal neighborhood alliances, if you will. Both of them are incredibly important. There is not a really strong permanence in any of it. A lot of it is flux and flow. However, it does depend on contracts, private property issues, and more political things. However, there's always a way. There's always a will. There's always a way. And sometimes this is about navigating that social scale of permanence. You may be surprised to find out the people you think are in charge aren't really in charge. If you're interested in landscape changes, for example, and the housing board doesn't want food landscapes, it's actually possible that you can go over their head or under, right? We go advance advocacy by going over people's heads, as it were, into like municipal jurisdiction rulings and see if there's some way to change it, which is again facilitating change for everybody, engendering good for the community. Or we can kind of undermine it and actually go to the authority, which is probably the landscape people, as well as your neighbors who would be reporting you or trying to charge you in this small personal district court that's been set up formally. Formally meaning, of course, it's been recognized legally as an entity and therefore has pressure and power. Informal block parties, potlucks, again, are forming these incredibly important social connections which allow for a lot of progress. We often have the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and that actually has a lot of truth to it. So, we're going to talk about these different forms of capital, including your social capital, your intellectual, your experiential. You have all these different resources that you're able to reinvest and use in your community to continue to deposit positive values that are going to clarify the social atmosphere, making it easier for you folks to get all of the benefit of where you are, who is in your community, and the resources that are available to you. Let's talk a little bit about some hard skills and tools that you too can use. Communication can be really hard, very challenging, and some of us are not what you would call gregarious. It's hard to get out. It's hard to meet new people. It can feel really stressful and anxiety producing. It can be very activating for your emotional pain body. And I want you to be gentle with yourself as you explore the idea of connecting with community. If this feels like a condition that you are currently experiencing, I want you to know you're not alone, and also there are allies in your neighborhood. There are people with a different superpower who can be gregarious and can go out and do social reconnaissance for you. Finding these network people, these nodes of connection, can be extremely helpful for you, whether it's sourcing resources, staying aware of what's going on in the community, or simply feeling just safer and more included. Believe it or not, a lot of people are going to understand that not everybody wants to be out in the community all the time, but a presence is appreciated and it's felt. The intention and the impact are both very important, but being able to let others know your good intention to support the community can be the first step in creating long-lasting relationships that are not only for your survival, but just for your enjoyment and pleasure of being. All right, so how do we get there? Once we're at this place where we're communicating in person or on the phone, virtually one-on-one with a neighbor, it's good to be very clear about your intentions to communicate. We want to remember our manners always. Being polite, it's a thing. One of the parts of being polite that doesn't get discussed that often is that communication is emotional labor. Even if you are gregarious and it's very easy for you to get out and communicate with other people, sometimes the person you're talking to doesn't have that superpower, doesn't have that feeling. And being able to hold that with compassion is going to be the first step to creating a long-lasting and flexible relationship, respecting your boundaries, but also respecting the boundaries of the people you're communicating with, and understanding that as you reach out to them, you are asking them to do a certain amount of emotional labor that they didn't have to do without communicating with you. So to reduce emotional labor and mitigate or prevent conflict before it begins, let's talk sales and introduce the sandwich. We want to bookend whatever information we're trying to convey or connection we'd like to make with positivity. One of the best ways to do this is to open with a gratitude and to end with a shared value, reaffirmation of a shared value. So some really low-hanging fruit examples of this would be gratitude. I'm really grateful that you had time to connect with me today. Thanks. That's really nice to just even have that acknowledgement. Feels good for people. They want to know that they are busy. They have things to do. It feels good, right? And you may find a neighbor who has nothing to do but talk with you. So there's that as well. Respect your boundaries and theirs. But opening with a nice, thanks for making time. It's great to connect with you. It feels really good and it sets a good tone. This works on a psychological effect called primacy, where first impressions really do matter and people are more likely to remember the first thing that they experience about you than any of the middle stuff. Recency effect is what helps us on the other bookend. So ending that conversation on a high note, I like to reaffirm values because it kind of ties it all in. Why am I connecting with you? What is the information I'm conveying? I'm really grateful, that we get to talk about this beautiful land we inhabit together. You can find your own verbiage, find your own way of saying it, but, isn't that road well taken care of? Isn't it nice that we have all this water available to us? Aren't we lucky to have this gorgeous forest around? It's so nice to have good neighbors nearby. Ending on that really positive note helps on a psychological effect known as recency, where we are also more inclined to remember the last thing we said to somebody or the last thing that was spoken to us. Again, this is about a long-term relationship cultivation. You are running a marathon here. We don't want to burn ourselves out with big emotional catharsis. It's not appropriate necessarily in the beginning of making long-term, meaningful relationships in the community. Catharsis is great when you want to communicate that big feeling, and sometimes art is a great way to do it. And I also recommend finding an audience that's both prepared for it and is able to hold your catharsis with compassion. Not always necessarily your neighbors. Another intention for connecting with others is to connect with others. Another intention for communicating is to simply connect with others. And that is also a very reasonable thing to go to a neighbor about. It doesn't need to be about conveying information, but whatever is the middle of your sandwich, conveying information or communicating socially, should be very clear. Again, so that person doesn't have to do emotional labor. Why are you here? This has never happened before. You've never shown up on my porch. If you've got a gravel truck coming in on Sunday or what have you, it can be really nice to just let your neighbor know. It's not essential information that you convey, but it's very polite, it's good etiquette, and it lets that person know that you are interested in their comfort, wanted to give them a heads up. Things like that. You're not asking permission necessarily, you're respecting your own boundaries, but you're making sure there's open channels of communication with each other. Likewise, if you're just looking to connect in the community and you don't have any information you want to convey, perfectly reasonable to say, hey, I just, realized we hadn't had a chance to meet and I wanted to introduce myself and say XYZ, come over anytime. I would like to get to know you better. Whatever that is, right? This helps reduce the emotional labor, which, let me tell you, being clear and concise with people, oofta, everybody likes that. I've never met a person who didn't like that. It's very helpful, especially in creating a new relationship. So, sometimes this is not the open canvas, blank canvas opportunity that you want it to be when you first connect with somebody. Sometimes there's already an issue in place. In these cases, it's really important to sink into nonviolent communication. This is Marshall Rosenberg's work, and there is a lot to share in it. So I'm going to show you my silly little graphic and recommend that you find more resources on it, because there are a lot. This is just an intro. My little notebook. We're doing the best we can with what we got. You know what I mean, friends? One day we're going to have fancy animations, and I dream big, but right now I have a notebook. So, nonviolent communication essentially is making a clear distinction between objective and subjective in the communication. What is the thing? What are the feelings? This is important. Again, most of the time, the only thing anyone can ever do anything about are the things. Your feelings are your own, my friend. So we're taking radical accountability for ourselves and our feelings when we participate in nonviolent communication. This is not only healthier for us, but it helps role model this behavior to others, which is healthier for them and for the long-term ecosystem in your neighborhood. So here we go. First, you're going to observe the action. What is it? When I hear you're bringing in a logging company and you're going to clear cut that landscape over there, how does this make me feel? I feel concerned. I feel nervous. I feel a little frustrated. I feel unheard. I don't think any of those are feelings, P.S., by the way. I'm not great at this. However, there are resources out there that can give you a list of what is sort of the appropriate feelings for really taking firm accountability. This is helpful because we can make up all kinds of feelings. You could say, I feel like garbage, but garbage is not a feeling. And it's not helpful. It's an emotionally loaded phrase that means something very different to everybody. So, reference a feeling list so that you can clearly state your nonviolent feelings. And then state what the need is that you might have regarding this situation. Do you think it'd be possible for them to build the road this way? Do you think we could, whatever the solution is, the need that you have is? And making that request. So I confused it there. But what is your need? I need to not have a ton of rainwater flooding my property. Can we build a swale system to help divert the water away? So we are observing the objective behavior and action. We are owning our feelings. We're clearly stating our needs in the entire scenario. And finally, we are requesting action. So in a lot of ways, when I say prep before you connect, not only do I want you to be clear ahead of time on your gratitudes and your intentions and what you're trying to say, I want you to be able to talk about it very, very clearly, as does Marshall Rosenberg and like everyone else you know. This might take work. You might want to write these things down ahead of time. Not that you have a script, but just that you're focused and you know where you're going in the conversation. If the conversation begins to get emotional or derailed, it might be best to excuse yourself until you can return to this previously written format that you've developed. Especially when we're dealing with landscape stuff, it is important that you know your needs and what their requests are. You can't just be mad at somebody for doing stuff if you don't know why you're mad. What is it about the clear cut? Does it change your view? Is it changing all the light on your property? Is it a soil erosion issue? Is it a rainwater issue? And if so, what is the strategy or technique that you're willing to offer to these people? You have to come with a solution. It's important if you actually want there to be one. If you don't want there to be one and you're just looking to be like a hissy neighbor, you're not cultivating community. You're just not doing that. So that's your choice. But if you want to cultivate that community, cultivate cooperation, that's how we get it done. This is how we cut to the meat of the issue and get out of our own way so that we can ensure community safety and comfort. Yay! All right, so we've got our delicious sandwich. We know what our clear intentions are when we're communicating, and we can use nonviolent communication. You may have noticed behind me, Don Miguel Ruiz, 4 agreements. These are agreements we've made with ourselves before we communicate as well. Prepping before we connect. We're going to be impeccable with our word. We only say what we mean. We don't say unnecessary things. We're not going to take anything personally because we recognize that nothing anybody does is really because of us. Everybody is haunted with their own ghosts. Everybody's processing their own life lessons. Everybody's managing their own judgment and curiosity all the time. And people have come with a whole life before you showed up in it, or are having a whole life that you may not have been aware of even if you were sharing it. They're experiencing it in their own way. So it's not because of you. Don't take anything personally. And we're not going to just assume things. We're going to be brave and ask questions. Asking questions, not making assumptions. And finally, just doing the best we can. Doing the best we can with what we got. You know, we're not all perfect. Nobody's perfect. And if we can just do the best we can on any given day, that's what we got, man. It changes every day. It changes moment to moment. Sometimes you're just too hungry. Sometimes you're just too tired. Sometimes there's just too many things in one day and you need to take a break. All of this is legitimate, but know that you're doing your best. Don't give up on yourself, because that's when we start to really get into cycles of depression and beating ourselves up, as well as living in anxiety. We need to reduce that conflict for ourselves. Because it ends up affecting how we show up in the world, and it'll affect the values you're putting out into the world. Trust me, I know, because I am a miserable person, and I have to work very hard at staying mindful that that isn't the energy I exude out into my environment. Because let me tell you, friends, as much as I might think it's a catharsis, expelling that negativity, what ends up happening is I generate more of it. There's different ways to experience catharsis and to process some traumatic events. But spewing negativity into the sphere can be really damaging, ultimately, to the whole ecosystem. So, let's talk about you. Now you've got all these different kinds of communication skills, right? I mean, there's manners. Manners are important. When I say manners, I say lean towards more conservative manners. Things like sir and miss go really far. Do not call women ma'am. They'll correct you if they want to be called ma'am, but call women miss. I don't care how old they are. I don't care. You call a woman miss, that's polite. When you call a woman ma'am, it's rude. All right? It's just what it is. Just letting you know. And you sir. And let me tell you, you want to do these things right off the bat so that you can make that mistake early on and correct. This is about being not only somebody who is polite and conscientious and showing that you can follow somebody's boundaries, but you're discovering those boundaries as well. If somebody's non-gender conforming, they will let you know. If somebody doesn't want to be called sir or miss, they will let you know. And they will offer to you a name that they've chosen that they like you to use. This is a great way to just make that real quick. Making mistakes early on and then regularly often is not a bad thing, especially because it gives you opportunity to consistently show your positive intention and your ability to repair impact. Again, important for building long-term trust and resiliency in the community. If you are not the most mindful person, if it can be difficult for you to remember things about people, let me offer a memory enhancement skill called Method of Loci, which you may have heard about. It comes from ancient Greece, and probably earlier than that, and is popularized by our good friend Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is well known for using the Method of Loci, which he calls his mind palace, and illustrates it regularly. This is the ability to observe different things happening around you and build a larger mental map of the entire scene. So it's using both visual memory skills as well as connective memory skills, embedding information in a larger matrix of understanding. This is a cool psychological tool that you can play with and use to enhance memory for lots of things. I find it very important when we're dealing with neighbors, both because it helps us remember what's happening in the physical environments that are adjacent to ours, which are intertwined with ours, as well as giving you an opportunity to be a more mindful neighbor. It feels so good when people can remember your name or certain little special things about you. It feels nice to know that you're held in somebody's social landscape in a positive way. The more you can develop those ways with other people, you're actually going to continue again to build reciprocity and bridges for resources in the community, increasing safety and comfort, enhancing our cooperative, cultivated community. So buttons, Eliot, goodness. We also want to make sure our body language is coming correct, meaning, that's a silly thing, I'm just being silly. There's really no correct body language. Lots of people have lots of different body language. Some people stim or have other physical things that they do to help them stay focused and grounded while they're interacting with other people or other stimulus. Being curious and okay with the way people show up is super important so that you don't contract into a judgment, but also it gives you an opportunity to lean into mimicry body language. If you can mimic or chameleon another person's body language, it sends subconscious signals to that person that you're one of them. This is like straight manipulation. This is another sales tactic. So slight changes in how you're sitting or even how you're talking can really help to develop a synergy or symbiosis that before was unavailable. And you can do this in a variety of ways. Again, this is part of meeting somebody with stoicism, with a bit of stoicism, and laying on a little bit of honey when somebody seems welcome to some saccharine sweetness in their life. You can take cues from other people and just slowly start to repeat what they're doing in the communication. It is actually a really interesting and subtle way of patterning yourself with others. It makes them feel like you're one of them. Now, beyond just being a nice person and manipulating somebody into loving you or liking you, I want you to also recognize your inherent value, the inherent capital that you have, the inherent capital you have. Beyond your financial and material capital, which is what we tend to think of, how much money do you have or property do you own, there is a dynamic capital available to each and every individual that is actually consistently leveraged in relationships, whether they're, fierce economic relationships or neighborly barter relationships. Let's talk about the 8 forms of capital. Graph paper this time. So Pierre Bourdieu, 8 forms of capital. Financial and material, these are those, we've talked about those, we get that. How much money do you have? How much stuff do you own? They're kind of zero sum. And frankly, less interesting. And not really all that important, actually. However, all the other 6 forms of capital, these are really big, important things, and we all have them all the time, and they're self-renewing, but there's some slight nuance here as well. Let's talk about them. Living capital. Living capital are the living things, the members of your community, and in this system that we're in, property that you own. We'll get into more of that in Zone 3, ownership, economy, politics, but living capital would be like the medicinals growing in the forest around you, the livestock that you care for, the food you produce from the garden, right? You have living capital. All of these things are exchangeable or monetizable. You can monetize. You can monetize all of this, but you can also just barter and trade it. In the neighborhood, I'm asking you to barter and trade the renewables. So living capital is a renewable. You can keep growing more food, and you can harvest seed and grow more and more. Social capital, this is that who you know, not what you know. Your social connections are incredibly important for advancing advocacy, making sure affected populations are integrated into the community discussions, etc. And accessing more resources. They don't have to just be social connections in the community. Social connections outside of your neighborhood are also important allies. Your social connections and social capital, they count. I like to think of social capital as things that we affect by reaching out to others and nurturing and developing those relationships. But cultural capital is also important, and that's sort of what the cultural world thinks about you from the outside and different cultures that you're used to. So if you're somebody who grew up in poverty, you've learned a whole set of survival skills and life sets for managing living in poverty. Likewise, if you've been to college for 16 years, you've learned a whole lot of skill sets for managing a college culture. So there are all these different cultures. We all have a different kind of cultural capital that we can carry. There's shared cultural values that we can step into. Cultural capital. And how can you leverage it, right? If you have white skin, that's a cultural capital in a white supremacist culture. How are you leveraging it? Right? What does it mean? These last 3, I love them so much. Intellectual capital, what you know, what you've learned, your book smarts. Experiential capital, your street smarts, what you know from what you've been doing, things you've learned by doing, and just experiencing, different life lessons you've had. And finally, spiritual capital, your ability to stay grounded and connected to yourself and sort of the divine, higher power, meaning, ethics. And bum-ba-da-bum, not only are they these 8 forms of capital, if you spend as much time thinking about them as I have, you'll realize that these 3, living, social, and cultural capital, are actually a pollutable resource. Even though these are renewing, you can stop renewing them at any time, and living capital can become polluted. You could accidentally apply chemicals to your landscape or toxify it, or kill your livestock. Your social capital can be damaged when you break your word, misbehave. Break people's boundaries is probably the best way to say it, or break social contracts. Cultural capital can also be deeply affected, both in a good way. Like when we want to break white supremacy, white people need to step up and remove that cultural capital. They need to find ways to invert it consistently. Likewise, if you're an academic cultural master, you can re-embed that culture to other students. And if you're outside of academia for a long time, that might no longer be a capital that you have. You may lose it. If you don't use it, you lose it. It's okay. You've got other capital. You've got other cultural capitals too. And your intellectual, your experiential, and your spiritual, these are really up to you. You constantly have the choice to learn new things and experience new things, work on your memory, work on your retention, stay grounded, breathing, meditation, taking the high road, that kind of work. Not so much pollutable from the outside, but you can kind of give up on them. These ones can be affected by our own actions. We can accidentally pollute our own things if we're not careful. And finally, then these suckers, I mean, they are what they are, but it's a zero-sum game. And it requires a deeper look, especially in econ and politics, if we want to have a meaningful discussion of that. Sorry, this is cardboard. It's a cardboard set. Doing the best we can with what we got. These forms of capital that you have are unique to you. I suggest you do an assessment. Write each one down. Take an assessment. What's my financial capital? What's my material capital? Ooh, now what's my living capital? What's my social capital? What kind of cultural capital do I have? What's my spiritual capital like, and how's my practice looking? What does my intellectual capital look like, and what's my practice there? And what's my experiential capital look like? Which is really massive. You've made it really far in life. You've learned so much. And it's huge. It's so important and often undermined. And it is actually a monetizable thing. We know more and more that experience counts. Anyone who's tried to get a job out of college. I'm sorry, that was not funny. That wasn't funny. That was mean. But yeah, experience really counts. So, what are we going to do with this capital now that you know what it is? Now that you've been looking at it and addressing it and cultivating your own capital? Well, just like we do with our water in the physical landscape, we need to manage these resources effectively. And much like we do with water, we want to slow it and spread it and sink it. And I think this graphic is like not even that helpful in this context. So let me just break it down for you real quick. When we slow it down, it means we slow down our process to actually reassess the values that we have and the resources. So constantly being imaginative and creative when we assess our resources, meaning those 8 forms of capital, but also in the physical environment, what seems to be a waste stream? What's highly available and abundant? This is part of our bioregion. This is actually part of your neighborhood, is this feature. So doing these big assessments and taking our time and thinking about it. I just found out from the Black Forager that plantain seed can be dehydrated, ground up, and used as an egg replacer. I didn't know that. So if you've got a community with a ton of plantain, this is a resource. Just pointing little things like that out. You never really know, and we can always be creative when we do try to assess what resources are available to us, as well as reasserting the values that we share as a community, making sure that we know, we appreciate natural foods that are different. We appreciate wild forage abilities, right? We appreciate knowing what's edible because we have children in the landscape that want to pick berries, and we can send them out to pick the edible ones, as long as we know which ones they are. Spreading resources in this case means ensuring accessibility and availability. And a lot of the times this is making yourself available in terms of intellectual or experiential capital. If you know a lot about gardening, it helps the whole community when you offer your help on gardening, especially if there's like a community garden project going on. Pardon me, quick sip of coffee. Making yourself and the resources you have available is a big thing in ensuring, again, comfort and security throughout the community. Don't overextend your boundaries, but consider that you are worthy and so valuable. And to gift yourself to others helps encourage others to do the same, and we're role modeling to our children how to do this work. Think about that. Or not. You don't have to if that's overwhelming. You think about whatever you want. Finally, we want to sync it. And this is about really leaning into that reciprocity, leaning into the intention, and knowing the impact of long-term investment. The world is great, again, when men will plant trees in whose shade they will never sit. Right? It's not just about you. It's about the whole community. It's not just what you get out of it. It's the fact that you're going to get something good out of it when the community feels better and feels safer. Anyone who's ever lived in an unsafe community knows it's not safe because there's a lack of resources and there's more desperation and more isolation, and it's easier for people to prey upon one another. And what's interesting is I find those in it's not even necessarily communities that are poor or impoverished. A lot of crime happens in very wealthy communities where there is an incredible lack of compassion and connection between people, and people seek to medicate that with drugs, alcohol, and it then ends up being kind of crazy behavior because of lowered inhibitions. Yeah. Breathe into that. There's a really strong and healthy way to show up. We've got some tools and skills we've just discovered and meandered through in our discussion of Zone 2. I want you to know that this is, again, that really potent zone. There's a lot of intersection happening, and it is a very activating zone, maybe for you and most likely for other neighbors that you have. So we want to keep being gentle and curious as we go through this work, and we want to keep showing up. It's okay to make mistakes. That's how we learn. And if we don't show up in this Zone 2, we never get the opportunity, or we really limit and restrict our opportunity to make bigger changes that can start to affect the landscape beyond our slope, beyond our watershed, beyond our bioregion. You know, we can begin taking the regenerative action that provides comfort and safety for the whole world. Yay, lofty goals! So have a block party, lean into some fun, find allies that can help do social reconnaissance work with you or for you, practice your formal and informal personal districting, get to know both your bioregion, your watershed, and your slope, as well as the social components that go into this. And I hope you're able to join me for Zone 3, where we'll talk a little bit more about those municipal and legal entity issues that do go into affecting how we interact with our neighbors, or what we even consider neighbors in a lot of ways. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you're having a beautiful festival and a fabulous 2020 as best you can. Hang tough, stay strong. Black Lives Matter. You know.